I have the pleasure, great pleasure, of introducing our first speaker this afternoon, Paul North, who is the Maurice Nathanson Professor of German at Yale University. Paul is the author of The Problem of Distraction. That's a title, not he's the author of The Problem of Distraction, Stanford University Press, 2011. A brilliant genealogy of distraction from Aristotle to Kafka, Heidegger, and Walter Benjamin. In 2015, he published The Yield, Kafka's Atheological Reformation, also with Stanford University Press, a fascinating meditation on yielding, on giving in. And I had the privilege, actually, of being asked to review maybe I shouldn't say that, being asked to review the manuscript of one of the most original books that I encountered, titled Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe, The Logic of Likeness, Princeton University Press, 2021. It's a treatise on likeness, as its subtitle says, and it's really completely unlike anything I have read, with its admirable mode of moving both scrupulously and inventively between so many unexpected regions and objects, between Darwin's notebooks and surrealism, between the Plotinian universe and Wittgenstein's Duck Rabbit, between Archimboldo's composite vegetable portraits and Gabriel Tard's sociology, and many, many others, with no eclecticism. Paul recently edited a book that came out last month, I believe, with Princeton University Press. He edited a new translation and critical reading edition of the first volume of Marx's Capital. And the title of Paul's talk today is, in its wonderful simplicity, For the Proletariat. Please, welcoming.
I would very much like to meet the person just introduced. Thank you, Peter. It's humbling to be in a room with so many people I respect, hawking this Capital book around. I don't have the same experience always. Nothing against the Marxists, but a little bit against them. This is called For the Proletariat. I want to make a modest proposal. Whoever reads Capital, especially Volume 1, but the other volumes probably as well, reads de facto for the proletariat. Whoever reads Capital reads for its existence, for its unification, for its basis in the economic and social system, as well as for the system's overthrow through it. Whatever their party affiliation, ideology, knowledge of Hegel's logic, whatever their class affiliation, whosoever reads Capital does this somewhat strange thing. Reads for a particular beneficiary or destinatory, one that is, by the nature of this move, not here yet. And so whoever reads for the proletariat does not become the proletariat, but prepares the way for them. Maybe the proposal is not so modest, since if accepted, it makes the book pretty dangerous as those who never read it assume it is from circumstantial facts like revolutions. If beyond your commitments and will, when you read Capital, you're acting for, towards, under the banner of, into, or in defense of, before, or in preference towards, expressing an emotion or a commitment of reason to, for, ... the proletariat, it might lead us indeed to eat the rich. Reading for, it is the gift of so subtle a thinker as Peter Zendy to give us this difference to think. For when we were taught to ask who a text was written for, to understand the structure of address, the inscribed reader, and further when we were asked to deconstruct the self by means of that reading, we were not obviously invited to question the Lutheran reading subject. Reading was by the self, for the self, leaving the vaunted technique, reading, an unthought remnant of selfish European theology and philosophy. At least this is how I read Zendy's call. With it, I see, if not immediately a way to do it, then at least a need to free myself of this narcissistic remnant. According to my modest proposal, whoever reads Capital reads for the proletariat, who is not the reader. And this will mean approaching Marx's magnum opus anew and giving up perhaps some of the perceived gains from reading it, for me or for us. Please be patient. It will take me several steps to outline who and how one reads for when reading Capital and why it may be important. To start with, there are too many fors to know what we're asking. A surfeit or surplus of these innocent little designatory operators. They gather into a ragtag group whose differences are not even the same differences. You could say that fors in English and also in German make up a lexical Lumpenproletariat, who gregate in a zone outside of language as system, where categories mix and there is little uniform relation to canons of sense or grammar. Let me sift three relatively distinct fors out of this unruly surplus population and then add a fourth. Yes, we're looking for for number 4. The first for I will speak to, one of the many fors of Capital. You can laugh too, when there are jokes. Maybe I'm too serious or they're not good jokes, but charitably. The first for I will speak to, one of the many fors of Capital, marks something as destined for someone, although they have not asked for it and are certainly not expecting it. At the front of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, you find a classic version of this for, a cliché even. Quote, "For my not forgotten friend Wilhelm Wolff, bold, loyal, noble champion of the proletariat, born in Tarnow on June 21st, 1809, died in Manchester on May 9th, 1864. What was Marx doing when he prefaced the body of his great takedown of the grandest system, the capitalist system, along with its intellectual shills and covers, with a small dedicatory for to a then and now unknown actor, whose credit at first glance was only to be Marx's friend? It is true, friend is not an epithet he would have used for many in the unreserved way he does here. The list of former friends, supposed friends, and enemies too would fill many pages. And so the dedicating act here is significant as the person was, but it is also multifarious and points to conscious and unconscious tasks Marx was wanting to accomplish with the book. It points unconsciously to the difficulty Marx had finding friends for himself and for his project. And it points unconsciously too at the related, unresolved task of finding the proletariat, let alone representing it. Wolff does seem to be unforgettable to Marx and to Engels as well. In 1846, when Marx and Engels were writing that long zinger, unpublished, though not forgotten by either of them either, the German ideology, in which together they boldly assassinated young Hegelians one after the other as punishment for conceptual crimes, when these two intellectual assassins, Engels and Marx, unquestionably friends, were in exile in Brussels, in walked another radical in flight from Prussia, Wilhelm Wolff. As Soma Morgenstern was for Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer, Wolff was a crucial external-internal figure who could report to Marx and Engels on their current object of obsession, the thing they wanted to access but couldn't, directly through their own experience at least, the so-called proletariat. Morgenstern was, for Benjamin and Kracauer, the real Jew, these two cosmopolitan Jews. Since coming from the Pale of Settlement, he could nonetheless also speak the languages of Vienna and Frankfurt. Morgenstern was that beautiful combination of traitor and informant and living representative of authentic Jews, although a somewhat faulty one, who, like Salomon Maimon before him, aspired to be at the center of Europe. Wolff was, in this sense, Marx and Engels' real proletarian, as real and as faulty a representative figure as Morgenstern was. In 1864, upon Wolff's death, Marx made sparse notes on his biography, likely to be used in an obituary or an encomium or a biography later. The first entry in the notebook page entitled Wilhelm Wolff is 1809, June 21, born in Tarnow, Schweidnitz district. I don't know why I'm reading in a German accent. The second is 1813, Russians. These two dates are very important because they give Wolff the creds for being an exemplary proletarian, and more than that, a hyper-proletarian. Real, not because of where he came from alone, but because where he came from was a bridge out of the past into the new era. Between Schweidnitz district and the Russians entered the new era. Wolf's father had been a hereditary serf in Schweidnitz, and when Wilhelm was a young child, his father was brusquely put off his land under Russian modernizing reforms, which meant capitalizing reforms. Wolf's father was the last serf and the first proletarian, and this amazingly contradictory object concretized the budding theory of history that Marx and Engels were constructing. After 1813, exploitation in Schweidnitz stopped being hereditary, and at the same time, the Wolf's family's means of subsistence stopped being hereditary too. That is, they started to starve. An original dispossessed, the young Wolf was the antipode of the young Hegelians. He grew up in full and recent memory of actual compulsion and no way out servitude. To boot, he witnessed its sudden end and conversion to capital processes. Wolf, the son, went on to agitate for worker rights, spent almost 5 years in prison for student organizing and actions against the state, became a teacher in Silesia, and wrote the hard-hitting article about the Silesian Weaver Uprising that inspired Heinrich Heine, Gerhard Hauptmann, and of course Marx and Engels themselves, with its depiction of the sudden devastating end of a way of life through capitalists and their technologies. Wolf spoke to workers about workers as a worker. His existence had intentional consistency, we could call it. He knew exploitation firsthand, not as a bourgeois observer, as Engels was, or a theoretical conjurer at second hand, as Marx was. A little uncharitable, but okay. Wolf knew from out of his self, or so it appeared to the two friends, who now had a third. What's more, Wolf was also a truth speaker. When recently released from prison, Wolf picked up an old Lutheran hymn and turned it through his journalism into a popular song that flew wildly through German-speaking worlds. One of the proletarian-sounded verses runs, quote, "A cringing dog, I pray to thee, Lord, cast the bone of grace to me." The song actually put Wolf back on government watch lists and helped Prussia help him into exile. For my not forgotten friend, Wolf. Wolf was called not forgotten perhaps because of his unyielding character, his unceasing work for the cause, but also because he was the thing Engels and Marx could not be, one who addresses the catastrophe of the capital system in the first person, an anomalous writer, worker, and subject-object, speaker and addressee, an unholy alliance of grace and fallenness who had, to quote his song, cast the bone of grace to himself. Yet in his dedication, Marx immediately demotes Wolf from this position of privilege. He's not a member, but a representative of the proletariat. He was the original and true proletariat, its forerunner and its advocate, but he becomes only its advocate. In the 40s and 50s, when they met Wolf, Engels and Marx were pro. They were for, that is to say, in favor of the mode of speaking for that my colleague Rüdiger Kampe and his students have described at length. He was an advocate, Wolf. So you could say that the dedicatory for, the gift of the book to one already dead, forgotten insofar as his world was gone and his task still unfulfilled, accomplished a remembering. The dedication remembers a way of orienting anti-capital intellectual work, while at the same time counting out a prose effect that would turn out to be different than the one Marx was aiming for in Capital. The dedicatory for gave the small gift of a different kind of book to one who couldn't enjoy it because he had practiced something else, namely advocacy. Before the scene of work and the scene of critique even opens, Capital registers a double death. It registers the death of labor that worked partially on behalf of itself, pre-capitalist labor, in the shape of Wolf's father, which ended emblematically with that figure. Later in its pages, Marx will unforget the bloody forces that murdered that kind of labor. And a second death is remembered also in the dedication. After this self-oriented feudal-style labor passed and was replaced by other-oriented labor, purely exploitative labor, the dedication registers the death of Wolf, but more the death of journalism or another kind of writing that seeks to change the world by speaking on behalf of its most oppressed. The dedication puts advocacy in its grave. No doubt the space of sense in which fors are deployed in Capital is wide, much wider than the dedicatory page. The dedicatory for might be a throwaway. the dedicatory label or ticket pasted on the book after it was written, the dispensable Woolf's for. After all, it does not answer the question who the book is for, the classic question of its intended or implied readership or audience. Woolf was certainly not the intended or implied reader, far from it. Yet we shouldn't discount the dedicatory for just for what it is not. This operation puts into play an important fantasy of Marx's. That is, the fantasy of companionship in the struggle to overcome capital, even though it continually disappointed him. It marks a fantasy companionship beyond working men associations, communist leagues, secret and not, certainly beyond political parties, and even beyond class. The dedication connotes the multi-generational and even transgenerational work that would need to be done for organizers and for actors in the World Republic of Letters to contribute to this cause. The fantasy opened here goes like this. Whoever I may be, I read toward a wolfish conclave of tireless worker intellectuals who are neither too exhausted from toil nor too exalted from high thought to write a critical theory and carry out the revolution at the same time. This is the fantasy. You take the ticket and you ride the ride. Entering the book, you find at least 3 fours that are active. And I will say, as I say, I will add a 4th as well. The dedicatory 4 has to be passed through, but it is passed through quickly. Maybe it's too fantastical, not real enough or realizable. The fantasy that a few true intellectual friends could carry the world into its next age on the shoulders of their prose. The next 4 after this one, 4 as on behalf of, is what others do, not Marx. Organizers and advocates, and certainly, though, what an earlier Marx had done before this project, and also what he continued to do while he was working on it, but in other milieus. Woolf, as I say, was himself an advocate-style intellectual. He spoke and acted unabashedly for the proletariat, just as throughout Volume 1 the factory inspectors do. You know, these are the great heroes of the book, of Volume 1. For the most part, Woolf and the factory inspectors do on behalf of very well. Their forework is indispensable for the proletariat. Others do it not so well. To wit, most political economists, who claim to be speaking on behalf of workers, or also workers, but partly because they ignore class as a fundamental category, the political economists are usually, in actuality, speaking for the bourgeoisie. For the proletariat can be a tricky intentional relay. It can and often does lead directly to the enemy. Woolf may be the only one who avoided this relay while practicing a fervent on behalf of, because he was close enough to the object. Woolf, a subject-object, a subject that was its own object, and the ideal of idealism. Marx and Engels obviously couldn't do this, especially Engels, who you know was the son of a factory owner and lived extremely well all the way up to the end, was not willing to give up his soirees and his money. And to give him some credit, didn't think that was the route to overcoming capitalism anyway. But he is a kind of a mini Musk. The idealist ideal of a subject-object, a subject that is its own object, Marx hopes to avoid this trap, although he had to find another path than Woolf's path. The way Capital positions them, you get the idea that both good and bad speakers for, as on behalf of, the proletariat are making a secret mistake, as though the mode could be faulty in itself. Perhaps this is because on behalf of has its good outside itself. It is a means and cannot be judged either by itself or by its ends. Whatever the cause, it is as though on behalf of has to be positioned in Capital, positioned, contained, and eventually sidelined. Those who work on behalf of the proletariat are quoted everywhere in Capital, quoted and made the objects of dedication, but Capital does not work on behalf of anyone for the simplest reason. Insofar as on behalf of has to be also in the interest of, the task of this book precedes it. Capital's for is before the work of on behalf of. Its task is to speak out plainly and directly the real interests of the proletariat, indeed of both major classes. And until the interests are clarified, on behalf of can just as easily be against as for the proletariat. Those who think they act for the good, but have not clarified what this means are the very most dangerous. To put this in terms of the capital project, the critique of political economy has to be carried out before the situation is clear enough and true enough to work on behalf of anyone or anything. So you read in order to find out who the book is for. Is it for the poor, the hungry, the out-of-work weavers, whose feudal hopes were dashed by capitalists and whose lives were ended by Prussian soldiers? That is already past, or that is still the past. We read, or start reading at least, after the uprising, for this unknown quantity. You, the worker, read as the subject severed from your labor and severed from the past poor, as the subject that does not know itself, that knows not what it does, the phrase that Marx likes to use a lot in the book. Ignorant of the shape, grounds, and immediate and distant causes of your unfreedom. You read looking for the true shape of your unfreedom. Whether that truth is, quote, the wealth of societies dominated by capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. That's the opening truth of the book, beautifully translated by my friend Paul Reiter in a new edition that is now out in stores. It's a beautiful commodity. Whether that truth is the opening truth or other truths that are harder to accept and more threatening even than the commodity. Established identities, such as worker or owner, are threatened more radically by a truth that comes in the wage chapter, for example. Quote, for labor to be sold in the market as a commodity, it has to exist. It has to exist before it can be sold. But if the worker could give his labor an independent existence, he would be selling a commodity and not labor. Ergo, where is this laborer? The proletariat has sold itself without ever possessing itself. No one has the proletariat, in truth, until they have read the wage chapter, after which, if it produces its effects, everyone has the proletariat. And so for on behalf of is as on behalf of is problematic in the book because we don't know what the proletariat is, and so we cannot properly advocate for it. Not Ricardo and not Wolf. We may at any moment be, unbeknownst to us, in fact, advocating for capitalists or for capital. This is what I would call the skeptical dilemma of reading for the proletariat or acting for them as on behalf of. There's a second dilemma that's less about knowledge and more about what the proletariat actually is, its makeup or being. Labor and its falsification in political economy knows not what it does because it is not itself to begin with. Because labor, as Marx said in the quote I read, is a double thing, a vexed thing, a self-abnegating thing, self-advancing and self-depleting, separable and inseparable, a kind of substance that nobody can get a hold of, even though it's exploited. So the proletariat begins as an agent against itself, with unclarified interests. And because its being is equivocal under capital, and this is a key interpretive shift, this gives the reader a goal, an aspiration. A reader reads, I think, in view of resolving this equivocal thing, labor, into its components and contradictions. A reader reads in view of a thing it can't quite make out. That is, and again, is really not. And further, a thing that, as other radicals in the revolutionary age were saying at the same time, a thing that will have to be abolished or resolved into something else as soon as it accomplishes its historical task anyway. The proletariat is not what it is, heading toward the demise of what it will have been and not been. So in addition to the skeptical problem of not knowing what the proletariat is, until you will have read the book, there is then an ontological problem. Once you do know what it is, if you choose to speak on behalf of it, you're speaking on behalf of a perplexity. And there are further complications. It is well known under the politics of speaking in a nominally democratic milieu that acting or working or speaking on behalf of substitutes one speaker for another. This instead of that. It implies that both groups could speak if given the opportunity, and until that opportunity comes, the first, which already has some privileges, replaces the second in speech. Wolf speaks where the weavers cannot, especially where bourgeois journalists have slandered them previously. Some journalists have been so shameless in their insults against, quote, our poor weavers, that Wolf writes, quote, I believe I am doing a service to the truth by describing the events as faithfully as possible. Advocacy is substitution, on one hand, And it is also, on the other hand, endorsement. Here is the third for. For not as on behalf of or in place of, but as in favor of. It should go without saying that the two operations do not always coexist peacefully within advocacy. Anyway, a whole profession speaks on behalf of without being in favor of, that is, lawyers. And a whole nation may endorse without speaking on behalf of, that is, political opinion. There is one way in which they do work together toward the same end, although it is a divisive counteraction. For of endorsing and for of substituting both ward off the desired end while they are calling for it. This is maybe, I think, Marx's greatest argument against advocacy. This can be put as a simple contradiction. If advocacy is happening, that which it advocates for cannot exist. If that which is advocated for already exists, advocacy is absurd. You can stretch this contradiction out in time, and that is what advocacy does, but it does not diminish the contradiction, it only turns it into a mode of living. Living the contradiction, that is the existential form of advocacy, and the real insult to Wolff by sticking him right at the beginning of the book and then never mentioning him again. It's a meantime effect, advocacy, like messianicity, and it is an important, deep aspect of critical theory early and late. In the long term, endorsement may well contribute to political or social change. Wait and see. In the short term, however, it is precisely that which is not that change. Let's examine for a minute the intentional structure of Capital's first three fours. They imply a specific ontology and history. Marx's dedication to Wolff is a perfect window for viewing the presuppositions around for in inaugural critical theory. By the time Marx dedicated the book to him, Wolff was dead. And what's more, he had left a small, but from Marx's impoverished perspective, substantial amount of money to the theorist for his family's subsistence. The dedicatory for is materially a quid pro quo, an exchange, and in addition, it does the work of mourning. Where the reciprocation cannot any longer happen, the reciprocation of friendship, a parting gift marks the spot. The book, in this one sense, is a send-off for the dead, a penny on its eyes. But it's not just too late for Wolff the person, it's too late for Wolff's method. So in this sense, the dedicatory for is a requiem for a promise, the promise, let's say, also sealed in the manifesto, which is highly Wolffish. Just a little sidebar on the manifesto. That text, masquerading for a while as a history of class relations, is finally a plaidoyer for the proletariat, explaining its place in history. This is the manifesto of the Communist Party. Speaking on behalf of the proletariat in front of an unself-knowing and hardened bourgeoisie. It is also an exhortation to this mysterious class. It tells it unabashedly, do your historical job. The text is explicitly written for the proletariat to read as and for itself, but there's a funny lapse there too. It has to get the message first in order to recognize itself as the proletariat so that it could get the message. Engels and Marx speak there as, quote, communists, as, quote, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every nation, that section which pushes forward all others. And this self-identification is crucial. As the advanced guard, but still as part of the class, they claim legitimacy to speak on behalf of and to the irresolute middle of that group as its own best voice. Compare those acts to the very obvious withdrawal from speaking on behalf of and exhorting in Volume 1 of Capital. The manifesto pushes, quote, for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. Pushily, it presents itself as a direct weapon in this fight. Capital does quote these gestures, but at a distance and with irony. Famously, it ventriloquizes the worker and the capitalist. Indeed, it blithely substitutes its voice for theirs within quotation marks, and at other times in Busian free indirect discourse. Capital's speech genre is obviously unlike that of the manifesto, but let's also recognize that its goal is probably not that different. In the afterword to the 1872 edition, Marx makes the similarity of goals apparent. Bourgeois political economy, as he calls it, could never represent the working class. But the critique of political economy could, if indirectly. Quote, insofar as such critique represents a class, it can represent only the class whose historical calling is to transform the capitalist mode of production and definitively abolish all classes. ... or in German, Gedankenstrich, the proletariat. It is the indirectness of these relations that interests me. Critique critiques, but it critiques on behalf of, and yet on behalf of, or representing, what it accomplishes is only effective if the class comes to meet it. And this class constitutes itself not under conditions or as the result of a process, but with a peculiar requirement that to be itself and for critique to be able to speak for it, the advocated subject has to respond to its historical calling, which is totally outside the power of critique. Let's stay with this striking quotation to understand it a little further. At first, it's surprising that Marx explicitly pulls the project back into the orbit of the manifesto and advocacy at this late page. This paratext, the 1872 afterword, an extreme opposite to the dedication to Wolff in space and also in sentiment, is there for readers who already read the first edition in order that they can see the changes Marx made in the second. What Marx ends up writing, however, is more like an apology for the mistaken reception of the first edition. If you read the afterword to the second edition, he's really riled that the people he wanted to read it, who were the theorists, didn't get it. But he's opening up to the fact that workers were actually reading it. This is, he thinks, a good thing, of course. We read, quote, "The labor I put into capital has paid off. Above all, in that right away the book found appreciative readers throughout the ranks of Germany's working class." This is not so much a self-congratulation as an entry into the complicated negotiations over the projected readership for this singular book. Who is it meant to be read by? Wolff? Those already associated with the Comintern? Its readership, Marx concedes, will be a product of historical circumstances, produced in the nexus of then current forces and constraints, including the language of the original, German, and the place of its first publication, Hamburg. A little bit of history. Since 1848, large-scale production had begun arriving in the Germanies, and the experience workers had had of its abuses had outstripped explanatory schemas produced by German theorists. This does not mean that German political economists had actually understood anything before large-scale industry took root. Marx writes, before, quote, "the swindlers arrived," back in the first half of the 19th century, German theorists could only lump together old-fashioned ideas about economics with philosophical chestnuts and sell the amalgam way above its value, which was in fact zero. Live theorizing from England, such as Ricardo's, fell on deaf ears in the Germanies. For this reason, Marx argues the book Capital, in German, could only be for the working class to read for themselves, a theoretical book that would speak to perhaps not theoretically, but certainly experientially, the working class that understood large-scale industry. Since 1848, they could read it with, quote, "appreciation." What's more, outside the continent of Europe, which couldn't appreciate it anyway, political economy had reached its own limit or come to a schism. Quote, "Consider England," Marx says. Even its relatively advanced political economy was written before class conflict became class war. Between 1776 and 1813, when German theorists were dreaming and German workers were still largely feudal, English political economy was deaf to the full-fledged capital system taking shape there, with its new abuses and new social divisions. Writing about an infant tells you only so much about the adult it will become. Ricardo, for example, could still have the rosy view that value production was generally a good way to distribute the goods of earth and society and to fulfill needs, although he did note the tendencies for wealth to drift upward and capital to grow faster than incomes in the new economy. But capital in advanced capitalism, with its concentration in a few hands and its reliance on machinery, with the changes to the mode of production, advanced the class opposition. The worker was no longer the Ricardian worker. With intensified class struggle came as well intensified struggle between theories. And just as Ricardo's theories could claim victory over the old views, like Hobbes and Locke's, just at the time when Ricardianism was being popularized and disseminated widely, including in the Germanies, the capital system had already transformed. The intensified capital relation, where a few owners hold back the means of production and extort labor from a vast number of workers, became a system in which workers had to live in order to work under extreme exploitation, de-skilling, immiseration, and the constant threat of superfluity. When the bourgeoisie gained complete control in England and also in France as a result of the politics of 1830, Marx tells us, class struggle became war. Marx calls this a death knell for political economy. So there's two requiems in the book so far, the requiem for Wolff, for journalistic and organizing advocacy, and the requiem for political economy as the reigning theory of capital. The problem wasn't theory per se. Of course, theory, if that's what we want to name the speech genre of capital, and there are as many reasons not to as there are to name it that, theory has a different relationship to the proletariat than advocacy does. Whether the advocacy comes as newspaper writing or as party organizing, both of which Marx continued to practice before and during the writing of Capital, as well as after. Nowhere does Marx say that theory on its own will have a direct effect on the capital system or on its natives. Theory is not even always the best revealer of capital's wiles. Witness English political economy, which got left behind by changes it couldn't capture. Witness German-speaking lands where the theory could not be received because it did not correspond to anyone's experience, yet. One of capital's great achievements as theory is to separate its object from the theory's category and names. The capital system, the theory says, moves itself in its own ways, changes through crises, treads down on some and raises other up differently at different times, putting its relays through endless reformulations, such as technical revolutions, labor force revolutions, tendencies toward the concentration of capital, the rise of new classes such as finance. That is to say, the theory says that what capital does is constantly changes and publicizes its changes in various ways. And this is a problem for the theory and its addressees. It has to meet its addressees where they are, and they have to meet it where it is. Okay. Getting towards the end. As a strange and strained relationship of necessity and contingency, never before seen, according to Marx, capital requires a special attitude from its theory. Theory has to become a partner to capital, a treacherous partner, to be sure. When political economy naturalized its object, in other words, it also naturalized itself, and theory must not do that. There was no question, according to Marx's analysis of the system, that the proletariat was partner to the capitalists as well, unwilling and often unknowing, but a partner nonetheless. Quote, "The accumulation of capital is therefore the propagation of the proletariat," he writes. All of the proletariat's reproduction schemas, their daily life, their own internal categories are dependent on the capital system. That's what it means to be a totalizing social system. The question for theory then was whether and when it was acting towards a hostile takeover and whether and when it was acting as a small stakeholder investing its dollars in the machinery of domination. Quote, "At stake was no longer whether this or that theory held true, but whether a theory hurt capital or helped it, was convenient or inconvenient, or accorded with the criminal statutes or violated them." This really articulates the stakes of the book for Marx. On one hand, he's talking about the overt henchmen, the vulgar economists who in England tried to justify and thereby enforce capital's laws. They trumpeted the benefits of free trade or the extension of the working day, even where they sounded a note of caution, like the famous and reviled by Marx URE, did about the length of the working day. They fell prey to other illusions, such as the, quote, "beneficial increases in the work intensity" in the aftermath of the Factory Acts. We should recognize also that at the same time As Marx is critiquing the vulgar political economists, he's also aware and slightly envious of the fact that insofar as capital depends on them and everyone is reading them, theory had acquired a lot of power. I'm going to skip down a minute here. The path for existing theories and existing peoples always seems quite narrow with Marx. It will not just be any theory, but the one that fulfills the historical conditions. It will not be just any readership, but the right one, the one that has been produced with the right materials by capital so that it can receive the message. This is in particular why the theory has to go into dangerous partnership with the phenomenon. It will not be just any group or grouping principle that arrives to overcome the system, but the one formed by its innermost pressures, which also and obviously form the theory as well, and not only the need for it, but its dearest terms and phenomena. Marx is really doing an imminent reading of Capital. And yet, even with all that nearness and necessity, despite what Marxists and Marx's critics have perennially said, and even though it may be necessary that things happen this way for there to be real change, even though change may be possible only along the narrow path, there's no necessity for any of this to actually happen, or to happen at any particular time. The right theory does not spring from the system's thigh, even though the materials for it are there. It takes a special kind of work between the contingency of articulating the theory and the necessity of its contents. The right reader for the theory, if one can make it, and Marx was never quite sure that he had made it. That's something you don't say about a book you just spent 6 years editing, but it is true that Marx kept revising this and revising it and was waiting constantly for the reports to come in of the next crisis. That is to say, he was never sure this was the right theory, even though he was sure it would take the right theory to get you there. An odd situation. The right reader follows the same kind of demands. Its raw materials are produced by necessity in the system, but the commodity, let's say, comes about through contingency and work, the same work as it happens as the theoretical work. Capital, workers, and theorists make the proletariat together in collaboration. There is a Marxoid legacy. If there is one, it is this very hard problem. How do we talk about the encounter between the theory and the conditions it wants to describe and also affect? How do we talk about the proletariat's dependency on the system and on the articulation of the theory that runs counter to the system, which they have to find and read through in their limited free time as an act of not laboring or as an act of non-alienated labor? Other questions pose themselves too. Is this an immediate encounter or a mediated one? And if mediated, mediated by what? Many of the problems in applying Marx theory in a revolutionary mode can be reduced, I wager, to this unthought and perhaps unthinkable mediation between the theory and the experience of those who then come to read it. The fourth four, the four that means something like in view of, is what I want to point to next. One reads Capital in view of a solution to this hard problem. How will it achieve its mediation? Will it have been the right theory? Are we the right people to be reading it? Have we arrived at this point? This I'm calling the revolutionary point of confluence. Obviously, the mediation can't happen within the theory, because the point, of course, is to change the world, not merely to theorize it. And it can't happen purely because of theory, because that would be theoretical determinism, the kind of Enlightenment dream that Marx certainly does not accept. The radically unformed nature of the theory and the reader is what makes reading Capital exciting and perilous. One reads in view of this point, in view of the revolutionary confluence where the theorist, the capitalist, and the worker become altogether the proletariat. In the afterword, Marx is still, I would say, somewhat erroneously talking about this complex mediation as representation, as Vertretung. And yet, at the moment he identifies the class represented by the critique, whose interest is represented in and as the critique, he steps beyond the four of this kind of representation. Speaking on behalf of, as substituting for and endorsing, is no longer sufficient theoretically or in practice. Quote, insofar as such critique represents a class, you have to hear that as a real caution. If it represents, it can only represent the class whose historical calling, deren geschichtlicher Beruf, is to transform the capitalist mode of production and definitively abolish all classes, Gedankenstrich, the proletariat. I want to emphasize that these dots are not a messianic issue. It is not a matter of the kind of temporality involved, whether it is continuous or discontinuous, that the proletariat should come or be coming. It's a matter of forces that may or may not align, happenings that may or may not happen, whose haps are organized modally. The forces belong to the still relatively chaotic field of history for Marx, and also to the ironclad necessitarian field of capital's laws, which has to enter chaotic history and encounter what it finds there. The laws of accumulation work for those who are accumulating, but other things are happening too, including the forces of critique, which run counter to them. You can see I'm working against a lot of the necessitarianism in Marxism. There are forces that belong to critique, and Marx is inventing them and trying to take account of them and trying to unleash them to bring about this revolutionary point. That point, if that's what we're after, is not on a single line. It's the nexus point of several lines. This is what I'm calling the proletariat. A point hard to reach that is not one single point, but the overlap of several lying on different vectors. Reading for it, reading for the point, means to move along at least one of those vectors. You can be a capitalist and read capital and move towards the proletariat, so long as you're tending toward the point at which you are helping to crystallize it. This says as well that reading means, when reading Capital as compared to almost any other books, that everyone who reads it is doing the same thing, the theorist, the worker, even the capitalist. This is my modest proposal. It's certainly modest when compared to extreme readings of Marx that call for totalities of one sort or another, and would be quite immodest, of course, to a traditional Marxist, if those still exist, for being very undialectical. No doubt this thought needs to be worked out further, most likely with reference to the short revolutionary section in Volume 1 called, quote, "The Historical Tendency of Capitalist Accumulation," which is anomalous in the book and very interesting in its rhetoric. Thanks.